Now this morning I've got to tell a story on my wife, Jewel. But before I do, I want for you all to know that I have her permission, so you don't need to be worried. As most of you know, I am from East Tennessee, and Jewel is from New Mexico. So our relationship has been something of a intercultural dialogue, shall we say, from the start, especially considering that we've gotten to know each other in New England, the motto for which I increasingly think ought to be frosty in more ways than one. Now, one of the most fascinating things has been the wildly different expectations Jewel and I have over seemingly ordinary events. Like, imagine what a couple of folks casually burning brush in their backyard on a humid Tennessee afternoon would look like to desert-bred Jewel, for whom wildfire is quite a scary thing. I had to talk Jewel down from calling 911, okay, on these poor neighbors of ours. Then there's me trying to eat green chili like her dad, Doug, does. Now let me just say, I get the hiccups when I eat something too spicy, and I have sat many a dinner with my in-laws out with the hiccups. Talk about first impressions. But the one that my folks get the biggest kick out of has been Jewel's reaction to the dump. Now, my parents live back in the country, so there's no weekly trash pickup, as Jewel was accustomed to all her life in Albuquerque. Instead, we chuck that heaping stink of stuff in the garage until my dad piles it all into the bed of his pickup and takes it in his weekly trip to the dump. Now, Jewel, when Dad asked her one time while she was visiting if she would like to go with him to the dump, was dumbfounded. What's a dump? And Dad totally ate this up and proceeded to drive Jewel the 10 minutes down the highway to introduce her to our brand new, to us anyway, trash compactor. Like you guys might take Jewel to the Met, okay? Now, I'm actually very grateful for how foreign everything seemed to Jewel, how foreign the dump was to her, because it threw into relief for me just how odd our relationship is to trash. And isn't it weird? Our routines around garbage are so deeply ingrained in us that they seem to be the natural way of things. Whether that means a weekly trip to the dump, or just simply pulling the bins out to the curb on Wednesday night. Either way, for most of us Americans, we try to get rid of that nasty stuff, and we try to do it as far away from us as we possibly can. Once it's in the dumpster or on the curb, it's as good as gone. Of course, we know somewhere deep down that's not actually the case. It has to go somewhere. But how many of us actually think about where the 1,600 pounds of the stuff that we generate each year goes? I'll let you guys off the hook. I did some research last night. Now, whatever you take to the New Canaan transfer station, which I take it is Yankee for dump, whatever you take to the New Canaan transfer station goes to a waste-to-energy plant in either New York or Connecticut. So now you know. But trash is an undesirable byproduct of human life that we would prefer to be disposed of in the most efficient way possible, and preferably in such a way that we know nothing about it. I belabor this because, friends, God cares about your trash. And I don't just mean the literal stuff, although God does certainly care about that. And if you're like me, you could pay quite a lot more attention to what you throw away, the 6 pounds of it that I'm going to generate just today, and where it goes. But I really mean that God cares about the trash of your life. Those parts of it that you would rather pretend didn't exist. Our gospel lesson this morning from the 12th chapter of John really begins in the 3rd chapter, from which our reading was taken last Sunday. And really it begins in the Old Testament book of Numbers. You all will remember from Sunday school that Moses, once he's led the people Israel out of their bondage in Egypt, does so only to land them in the wilderness. where they wander around forever and ever and ever. And the Israelites are angry about it. They whine and they wail to Moses, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" They complain about the food that they're having to eat. You guys remember the manna that falls from heaven, right? So the Israelites have miraculous food, and they're like, "Oh man, we're so tired of this stuff." Now that's a very human reaction to God, to the wonders of God's creation, but that's another sermon. They're whining to Moses, "Why have you brought us to die in the wilderness?" And God gets fed up with their complaining. And God says, "You think your life's bad now? I'm going to send you an army of poisonous snakes, and the snakes are going to bite you all, and you're going to be poisoned, and you're going to die." And that's what happens to many of the Israelites. Moses, ever the faithful go-between, the intercessor for Israel to God, implores God to spare them, and God concedes. God tells Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." And Moses does so. He crafts a serpent of bronze and sets it on a pole, on which all those who were wounded with venom could look, and they were healed. Now, in last Sunday's reading from John, Jesus compared himself to that serpent on the pole, saying, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Whereupon follows that most beloved verse, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, to the end that all that believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." That comes just after he said, "I'm the serpent on the pole." This is all quite crucial to what's going on in our gospel this morning. See, John's gospel is famous for the way it renders Jesus' crucifixion a glorification. Jesus' crucifixion is the moment when the one he calls Father glorifies him. It repeatedly makes puns, basically, that can be summarized by pointing to Jesus, hanging on the cross, and saying, "High and lifted up." Now, we should be clear. That's nearly perverse to say. Crucifixion was historically a most shameful way to die. It's equivalent, basically, to drowning in one's own bodily fluids. And it was reserved for only those who presented a threat to the imperial Roman order of things. For John to say that the cross is a moment of exaltation, that it is the means by which the one Jesus calls Father will glorify him, it's mind-bogglingly awful. It ought to make us cringe. But here Jesus is doing just that. "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." Lest we think that Jesus is talking about him coming back in glory on clouds, or as if Jesus is going to be sitting on some throne, John's author goes on to clarify, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. Now, I want for us to sit for just a minute in the total, all-encompassing character of that all people. Or as other ancient manuscripts have it, all things. Jesus makes no exceptions here. If I am lifted up, I will draw all things to myself. Just as the Israelites, bitten by the serpents, were cured by beholding a representation of what had poisoned them, a snake, so all the world is redeemed by beholding a representation of all that afflicts us. Jesus taking on all our shame, all our sin, and registering in his mortal body all the horror and suffering the powers of death can deal to us. See, Jesus' is a life utterly ruined. Cut down in the prime of his youth, far before he had to die. A seeming failure to his people. Just one more casualty in the hopeless cause of Israel's freedom. Torn from his friends and his family. The crucified Christ is capable of drawing all the world to himself like a magnet, because he has taken on in himself all that is worst in us and all the worst that can possibly happen to us. Whether it's your life that's been ruined, or whether you have ruined the life of another. Jesus is our trash. We don't have to wonder where it goes, because it all goes to him. It's all there with him on the cross. Beholding it there, aching in his body, weighing down his shoulders, cracking in his chest, is the way we are healed. By allowing all that is rotten within us to incinerate in him on that hill outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem. Let your sin die with him on the cross. As we enter this last full week of Lent, I hope that we can all take a moment to sift through and take stock of the trash of our lives. Those parts of us that we hope New Canaan never finds out about. Those secrets we reflect on only late at night in the privacy of a silent house when everyone else has already gone to bed. Painful memories of wrongs we did or which were done to us that have never been healed. Bag it up. Bring it to the cross. Toss it into the furnace of this altar. The furnace in which the bread of heaven is baked for us. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, even Jesus Christ. Amen.